Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading to Japan for a chilling collection of paranormal and ghost stories. These are all thanks to my good friend Jay Nightmare, who provided the stories, as well as 3 narrations too. He is a phenomenal creator, and if you would like to support his work, you can do so by following the link at the top of the description or at the end of the video. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened when I was really young. So young, in fact, that I don't remember any of it myself. I must have been around 4 at the time, and everything I know from this story comes from my mum, who told it to me some years later. Back then, we lived in a rural town in Sanda, Hyogo Prefecture. Calling it rural was an understatement, as the nearest convenience store was an hour away on foot. And if you wanted to go to a proper shopping centre, you had to drive nearly an hour. However, my parents liked that kind of life, as it was quiet and peaceful. And, for me, at the time anyway, it was completely normal. But at night, there was something about. Now, around that time, Japan was still in the middle of the bubble economy, and land was being developed everywhere. Forests were subsequently cleared out, hills were flattened, and new neighborhoods were appearing almost everywhere overnight. The area where our house stood had originally been a basin surrounded by small ridges, and according to the people in town, that land had in fact once been a cemetery. The graves were not respected. They were removed, the ground was leveled, and made way for houses to be built on it. The real estate company never mentioned any of that though, of course. But it was something the locals were very aware of, and some of them very unhappy with. My mum said the atmosphere, after dark in the house, was uncomfortable. And I think if I were to expand on that, I would say that there was a constant feeling of somebody watching, but you couldn't see who. My parents were both aware of it, and because of it, avoided going out late whenever they could. But other than that, life was normal. That is, of course, until I started getting into trouble. Apparently I was a difficult kid back then, and misbehaved constantly. And when I did, my parents used the same punishment of locking me inside the closet in my dad's room until I calmed down. It was completely dark in there, and for a small child, it was terrifying. I would cry, apologize, and after an amount of time they would let me out. And seeing as it worked, they kept on doing it. One day, remember I was still about 4, I drew all over the wall with a crayon. My mum got understandably quite upset, and the punishment was of course going to be being locked in the closet, which made me cry. But this time, she said the way I screamed wasn't normal. I wasn't just crying or throwing a tantrum, it was a desperate panic that she had never heard from me before, and it scared her enough that she opened the closet much more prematurely than usual. When she did, I was pale and completely drained of all energy. She still assumed it was just because I was more afraid of the dark and didn't think much more about it. The next day, I got in trouble again, and when my mum grabbed my arm to put me back in the closet, I reacted in a way she'd never seen before. I started screaming, "No, not the closet," and fought her as hard as I could. This was no ordinary resistance. After a while, she calmed me down enough to ask me what was wrong. Eventually, I managed to get the words out that there was somebody else in there. And when she heard those words from me, in her own words, she felt a chill race down her spine. So of course she went to open the closet and check, but there was nothing there that shouldn't have been in there. No extra person like I had claimed. She asked me who I saw and how they got there and what they looked like. But I didn't answer her. That night, when she told my dad what I had said, he admitted something he hadn't told her before. He said that sometimes when he slept in that room near the closet, he heard something. At first, he thought it was mice or insects, but it didn't sound like scratching per se. It sounded more like a voice. It wasn't very clear. He couldn't make out the words. It was quite faint. But it didn't sound like normal talking either. He tried to ignore it, but after hearing what I said, he was no longer able to brush it off. My parents contacted a nearby temple that handled things like that. In rural areas, temples often keep old records about the land, and people would often go there if something felt off. The priest came to inspect the house and spent a long time walking through each room. When he reached my dad's room, he stopped in front of the closet and simply stood there staring into the darkness. After several minutes, he started asking questions about when the house was built and whether the land had been altered before construction, but my dad didn't have any answers. He did say that he had heard people in the town talk about a cemetery being here before, but he didn't know for sure. After that, he excused himself and said he needed to check the temple. He returned the next day, and he told my parents that the temple still had fragmented records about this area. It turns out the basin where our neighborhood stood had indeed been used as burial grounds, but long before that, it had actually been an execution site during a local conflict centuries ago. Some of the dead were never properly buried, and only partial remains had ever been recovered. Then he told them they should leave the house as soon as possible. He said there was the spirit of a woman, and that her presence was concentrated inside the closet. She had died violently, her head severed, and what remained, only the head, is what lingered there, and that she was always watching. My dad asked about the whispering he had been hearing at night, and the priest nodded. He said if the voice sounded faint or weak, it could be because the spirit had no body. He believed she was repeating the same last words over and over. The priest performed a small purification ritual, but then he warned them not to rely on it. He said the resentment tied to that land was old and hadn't faded. It was after that that my parents decided the best thing to do would of course be move. They found another place and left as quickly as they could. And after we moved, my fear of closets was gone. I have been living alone in Tokyo for the past 2 years. My apartment building is in a pretty central location and along the railway tracks. My apartment isn't the biggest, but it's good enough for me. As soon as you walk in through the front door, you pretty much step into the kitchen. There are 2 other rooms towards the back of the apartment. It's a comfortable enough place to live in, with a nice-sized bedroom and living room. But one issue is that sometimes the electricity goes out. I always thought this was down to passing trains living so close to the tracks and all. So what usually happens is I hear the sound of an approaching train and brace myself for a possible blackout. And after a few seconds all the lights would come back on. The breaker never gets tripped though. It was just an odd quirk of the apartment. I didn't like it at first, I mean who would? But soon I learned to live with it. I didn't understand why it did that, but I guessed it was just down to faulty wiring or something. Well, one night I came home after working late. I would usually prepare my evening meal before taking a bath. I checked the time and it was 7 past midnight. Shortly after that, I heard the familiar sound of the train approaching, and then the lights went out. Because I'm usually in the bathroom when the lights go out, and I was in the kitchen, I was really spooked. The lights going out in the bathroom had sort of become part of my nightly routine. I looked up, and my eyes were drawn to the living room. The whole apartment was in total darkness, and I noticed something was off, and that's when I saw it. There was a shadowy figure that was standing in the middle of the living room. It was definitely human, I could tell by the outline. It was unbelievably frightening to see this shadow person there. I knew I had seen it. It turned to face me and started moving across the room towards me. I was frozen in horror. As it drew closer, it raised its right arm, and just as it came within an arm's length of me, the lights came back on. With the apartment now lit again, I could see everything. The laminate floors, the walls, the living room, they were all the same. There was no shadow in my apartment. I looked around for a reasonable explanation for what I had just seen, but couldn't find anything. At one point I thought it might have been a trick of the light outside, but it was a very tenuous conclusion. The black shadow or shadow person is still in my room. It seems it only appears in the living room. If you're in the bathroom or hall, you won't see it. I really should move apartments or get someone to help cleanse mine. But I don't know where to start with all of that, to be honest. And it always happens at 7 minutes past midnight. If I'm still awake, I make sure I'm in a different room. It's good to know how to live with it for the time being. But I'm worried about coming home drunk one night or falling asleep on the sofa and waking up to that. A few years back, I had a very frightening experience while I was out driving. It was the Friday before the Christmas break, and I was driving along a national highway at night to visit my long-distance partner. I finished work a little later than I wanted to, so by the time I headed out on the road, and even before I left, it was dark out. As my journey progressed, I noticed that the cars on the road gradually decreased as I got further from the city centre. I was tired, but really looking forward to seeing my boyfriend, so I decided to take a short break, as not to cause an accident. He lived far from my city, and I had another 2 hours to drive before I got to his town. I got back on the road, and I was in the zone. I drove while listening to some music, didn't even care about what kind of time it was, but when I checked the dashboard, it was just after 1:30 in the morning. It was around this point that the smooth national highway roads had ended, and now gave way into winding mountain roads. Luckily, there were no cars on these roads, so I was able to go at my own pace without being rushed. I kept things to what I would describe as a comfortable speed, and I was enjoying the music on the radio. However, when I rounded a hairpin corner, the radio suddenly fell silent. At first, I thought it because I was driving out in the middle of nowhere and that the signal must have dropped. It did that weird static, buzzing hiss where it searches for signal. I put up with it for a while in the hopes it would find the radio station again, but it didn't, and something else happened. I heard a faint voice coming through the storm of static. I thought that might have been just cross channels and hoped it would be fixed soon. But then, something very strange happened. It suddenly felt as if someone had jerked the steering wheel to the left. This caused me to slam on the brakes and pull the car to a stop in the middle of a mountainous road. Along this pitch black road, the only light source that was available was the one from my headlights. I didn't want to listen to the static anymore, so I turned off the engine. It was a cold night, and as soon as the heater was shut off, the windows began to fog. I was really shaken up and wondered what the hell happened. I had no idea what sudden force seemed to direct the steering wheel, and I was scared of what I had just experienced. Picture it. It was the middle of the night and something completely unexpected and unexplainable had just occurred. My heart was absolutely pounding in my chest. I tried to calm myself down. I started the engine again with the hope that I would get some kind of radio signal. It was still static. I went to shut it off, but then a voice came through louder than all the other crosstalk I heard that night. "Come see me soon." I broke out in goosebumps. I didn't know what else to do, but shut off the radio and speed away from the area. I just wanted to get out of those dark mountain roads and back on the highway. It only took me about 10 minutes to get back to the bright lights of the highway, but the whole time I drove through those dark, winding mountain roads, that cold voice I heard still rang in my ears. When I finally arrived at my boyfriend's place and got a chance to tell him about what I experienced, he laughed it off and said I got worked up because I was overtired, and said it was an auditory hallucination. But I don't think it was. It's something I don't think I'll ever be able to understand. Maybe something happened out there on the road, or maybe it's like my boyfriend says, an overtired mind. Just to be on the safe side, I chose not to drive along that road when I go see him anymore.
This happened a few years ago during the rainy season. The camping boom was in full swing at the time. I had already gone on 2 family camping trips, and after that I started thinking about what everyone online was talking about: solo camping. So I bought a small dome tent designed for one person. Since it was my first time camping alone, I figured it would be better to go somewhere quiet rather than a crowded campground. After looking around, I found a free campsite deep in the mountains. It was maintained by locals, but officially managed by local government, and reservations were required. On the day of the trip, I finished work in the morning and drove out there. When I arrived in the late afternoon, I noticed something immediately. There was no one else there. Maybe it was because it was a weekday, but the entire campsite was empty. At the time, I remember feeling lucky, like I had the place completely to myself. The campsite itself was pretty simple. There was a washing area, an old pit-style toilet, and a small pond nearby. That was about it. Still, the place was clearly maintained, and the grounds were clean. Before it got dark, I set up my tent and I started preparing dinner. Dinner was simple. I cooked rice in a mess tin and grilled some meat over a burner. I had brought a slightly more expensive beer than usual, thinking it would make the solo camping experience feel all that more special. And after eating, the fatigue from the day finally caught up with me, and before long I crawled into my sleeping bag. Part of me wondered whether I'd actually be able to go to sleep alone out in the mountains. But maybe because of the beer, sleep came quickly. Then, sometime deep in the night, sleep paralysis hit me. I've experienced sleep paralysis a few times in my life, but I never expected it to happen out there, in the mountains. Just as that thought crossed my mind, I became aware of something moving outside the tent. At first I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal. A wild boar, a bear, maybe a stray dog. But then I heard it clearly. Zuru, 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 zuru. The sound grew closer. It sounded like someone pulling something heavy or dragging their feet as they walked. That presence began slowly circling my tent. I tried to reach for my lantern, but my body wouldn't move. The paralysis still had me pinned down. The dragging sound stopped above my head, right near the top side of the tent, and then a woman's voice. Soft, weak. Help me. I'm certain that's what I heard. Then the dragging sound started again, that horrible zuru zuru, zuru zuru, zuru zuru, slowly moving away into the darkness. After the presence left, the paralysis finally lifted. The whole thing probably lasted only 2 or 3 minutes at most, but to me it felt far longer. I wanted to believe that it had all been my imagination, a misunderstanding, anything. But there was no chance of sleeping again after that. I curled up inside my tent and I waited for the sunrise. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I decided I would pack up and leave immediately. While I stepped outside the tent, the campsite looked exactly the same as when I arrived. Quiet, empty, still. But when I turned around and looked at my tent, something made my stomach twist quickly. Even though it hadn't rained, there were muddy handprints all around the tent. Now, they were not random splashes. They traced a path around it, like someone had slowly dragged their hands across the fabric while circling the tent. And the moment I saw that, I could honestly feel the blood drain away from my face. I hurriedly threw my camping gear into the car and left the campsite without looking back. Later, after I got home, I tried searching online for any ghost stories or strange incidences that related to that campsite, but nothing really came up for me. But when I tried to widen the search to the surrounding area, I actually found something else. Just a few kilometers away, there was a tunnel locally known as a haunted spot. The tunnel had a reputation. Every year during the rainy season, people claimed to see the ghost of a long-haired woman dragging one leg as she walked through it. And when I looked into it further, I learned something else. Several decades ago, during this rainy season, there had been a hit-and-run accident in that tunnel. The woman who was struck had apparently tried to drag herself forward while calling for help, and she died inside that tunnel. About 2 months ago, before my camping trip, a new road had opened nearby, and the tunnel had been closed off and abandoned. Something to do with rock slides, I think. After learning all that, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I had somehow drawn that spirit towards me. I've always been told that I'm a bit sensitive to that kind of thing. The thought bothered me enough that I decided to get rid of that tent. At first I thought about throwing it away, but it just felt strange to me to discard it, so instead I listed it on a flea market app. Because of the stains, I labeled it as bad condition, junk condition, and sold it for less than half the normal price, which means there's a chance somewhere out there another camper is still using that tent. Who knows? Next time you go camping, could be someone next to you.
My grandfather's hometown was in Abaraki, Japan, and back in the old days, burials there were done in the traditional way, by placing the dead directly in the earth. The coffins they used weren't like the rectangular wooden boxes we think of today. Instead, they were shaped more like barrels, and the deceased were placed inside it curled up, or in a sitting position with their knees tucked against their chest. The cemetery itself wasn't on solid inland ground, but tucked away behind a dense thicket of trees just beyond the beach. For years it sat there quietly undisturbed, until nature began to reclaim it. Around the mid-1960s, coastal erosion started eating away at the shore, and the waves crept closer and closer to the burial grounds. Each year the tides came in just a little further, licking at the graves that had once been safe from the sea. By that time, most families had already moved their ancestral graves to safer locations, leaving behind only the lonely, forgotten dead, whose family lines had disappeared over time. They were the Mwembotoke, the abandoned souls, spirits with no living descendants to tend to them. Even as the sea swallowed more of the land, no one did anything to protect the remaining graves. Probably because they weren't directly responsible for them. Or maybe it was an unconscious reluctance to disturb the dead any further. But whatever the reason, the cemetery remained untouched, even as some of the graves began to vanish beneath the tides. It wasn't before long the inevitable happened. The waves began to pull at the soil, carrying it away grain by grain, and as the earth eroded, some of the coffins started surfacing, their lids long since rotted away. Bones, once hidden beneath layers of soil, were now exposed, and when the tide was strong enough, it carried them out to sea. That stretch of coastline had always been dangerous. The waters looked deceptively calm and shallow for a long way out, making it easy for people to wade in with confidence. But then without warning, the seabed would drop off into a sudden, terrifying depth. The current there was treacherous, strong enough to drag even the most seasoned swimmers out into the abyss, never to return. And of course you'd have to be brave to swim out there anyway, as who knows what manner of sea creatures are waiting there all as well. Local fishermen and villagers had always known better than to swim there, and they warned outsiders to stay away, not that they listened. The year the bones began to wash away, a typhoon struck. The storm brought towering waves crashing into the already weakened shore, and by the time the winds had settled and the waters receded, there was no trace of the cemetery left. Every single grave had been erased by the ocean. And it was after that strange things started happening. The people who lived near the shore reported hearing voices at night, whispers. Some even claimed to hear someone calling out. The villagers who had ignored the problems for so long could no longer turn a blind eye, and they decided the abandoned souls needed to be put to rest properly. They needed to be acknowledged, prayed for, and honored. And so they built a shrine on the high stilts where the graveyard had once been, hoping it would serve as a place for the spirits to gather and find peace. Around that same time, Japan's surfing culture was booming, and a group of thrill-seekers started scouring the coast for new undiscovered spots with great waves. That cursed beach, with its strong tides and deadly undercurrents, caught their attention, and they had no idea what happened there. One by one, though, they disappeared under the sea. At first, of course, it was just seen as bad luck. People underestimate the sea all the time, but a surfer who survived spoke of something grabbing their legs and yanking them downwards. Others swore they saw figures standing waist-deep in the water, only to vanish as soon as they looked directly at them. The town tried to put a stop to it, putting warning signs, banning swimming and surfing, but it didn't matter. The ones who came looking for adventure never listened, and the death toll began to climb. It was only after the shrine was built and the proper offerings were made that things began to quiet down, and the disappearances became far less frequent. Still, to this day, my cousin tells me that you might still be able to hear it if you listen properly when you're near the coast. Maybe the spirits finally found some rest. I hope so. It was May of 2022, when I had an eerie experience during a night of fishing. So there I was, night fishing by the breakwater. For those who may be unfamiliar, breakwaters are man-made coastal structures that are popular with anglers because they can be good places to fish. These structures are usually built parallel to the coast and are made of large boulders that fit loosely together, creating holes that smaller fish can use as shelter. Usually this spot had a crowd, but tonight I was the only person there. I was in a great mood, thinking I'd have the place to myself and could focus entirely on my fishing. It was a full moon that night, the tide was high, and the conditions seemed optimum. But there was one problem. The moon was right in front of me, shining way too brightly. Now, for some reason, fish tend to be less active when that happens, and I started thinking that perhaps I wouldn't have much luck with my catches. But then out of nowhere, I began getting some strong bites on my line. Every time I reeled in, though, there would be nothing on the hook. Well, no fish. The bait would still be there, though, untouched. As any seasoned angler would, I tried a couple of different baits, but nothing was working. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I kept casting my line. I was determined not to give up. And then something strange happened. As soon as my float sank into the water, a round object popped up right beside it. The sea was shimmering with the reflection of the moon, so from my vantage point, the object was backlit and appeared to be pitch black and about the size of a bowling ball. Is that a buoy? I wondered. But then the object suddenly sank below the surface again. Could it be a porpoise? I thought, but quickly dismissed it. Porpoises don't stop like that. And if it were one, it would have surfaced to blow air. I concluded that it must have been some animal messing around with my fishing gear. After that, the bites stopped completely. I had a few nibbles, but now I was getting nothing, which left me feeling irritated. So I decided to take a break. I put my rod down, grabbed some sake from my cooler and my cup, and sat there sipping it while the wind died down. The sea became so calm it looked almost like a mirror, and I ate some dried squid and finished my drink, and started to feel more at ease. I took a deep breath and felt a little less tense. Sitting on the cooler, I twisted my body around, turned on my headlamp, and opened the tackle box that I had placed to my right. I fumbled around until I found a small float that I figured would be just visible enough in the calm water. My plan was to try and detect even the tiniest bites. I started to stand up to my original position, but as I turned back around, I caught sight of something. There, just above the edge of the breakwater, I saw a woman's face staring at me. I felt like Mike Tyson had launched a punch right in the center of my chest, and the shock ran through my whole body. The woman had long, slightly wet black hair parted in the middle, and she was glaring at me. I was so startled that I could feel my heart, ears, and nose thumping in sync, but I didn't scream. Immediately my thoughts turned to the paranormal, but then I realized her face looked completely ordinary, like anyone you'd see on the street. I have no idea how long we stared at each other, but eventually I started to calm down a bit, even though she was glaring. "What are you?" I said. Her stare never faltered. "Do you need something?" There was no reaction from her, though. I decided I had to do something, so I forced myself to get back to fishing. I looked away from her, turned back to my original position, and with trembling hands, started changing my float. I didn't want to be intimidated, so that's why I didn't leave. I'm stubborn by nature, and I was fumbling so much I'm not even sure if I tied it correctly in the end. But somehow I managed, carefully avoiding shining my headlamp in her direction. I bent down to get some bait and put it on the end of the hook. I switched off the headlamp and cast my line again. I mean, I probably should have left right then, but then I wouldn't be sharing my story if I had. At that point, there was no way I could concentrate on detecting any bites. I knew she was still there just to my right, but the background was a mess of complex shapes from the tetrapods, so I couldn't see her from the corner of my eye. The only option was to completely ignore her and try to wait her out. Surely there would be nothing in it for her to be hanging around here by the sea watching me fish in the dark, right? Well, a little while later, my float suddenly plunged into the sea. I jerked the rod to set the hook, but once again, nothing. I turned on my headlamp, grabbed the dangling line, and shone the light towards the bait box. But the whole time I had my headlamp on, I was too distracted by thoughts of the woman. I couldn't help it. I nervously let the beam of my headlamp sweep towards where she had been, and she was gone. But then I felt something behind me. I stiffened up. I heard 2 soft footsteps, and I forced myself to look straight ahead. I hurriedly packed up my gear and moved to the end of the breakwater. In hindsight, I should have just gone home, but I'd been fishing in this spot for so many years that it never occurred to me to leave. What did she want? I was trying to stay calm, but my nerves were all over the place. I kept pulling out random items from my tackle box, putting them back, picking up my rod, sitting down, opening and closing the bait box, anything to distract myself. Finally, I managed to bait the hook and was about to cast my line again, and as I moved my gaze from my hands to the sea, there she was. She was still there, only her upper face visible from the edge of the breakwater glaring at me. She was now in the water, peering up at me with eyes that fathered no emotion, staring blankly like the creatures of the deep do. She's back. The woman, though, didn't react. With a sniffle, I reached into my cooler, pulled out my sake, and hesitantly placed it in front of her. "Would you like some sake?" I asked, trembling. But her expression never changed. I slowly lowered my hand and placed the cup in front of her. "Want some dried squid?" I offered it out, holding the open bag and placing it next to the sake. As I pleaded with her, tears streaming down my face, she slowly drifted away from the edge of the breakwater and slipped underneath the water itself. I remained frozen before finally daring to stand up and peek over the edge of the breakwater. Nothing was there. The waves gently lapped against the breakwater, making soft splashing sounds, and I grabbed the sake that I had left out in front of me, opened it and took a big gulp, but immediately started choking. There was no flavor. It was definitely alcohol, but no longer tasted like sake. I tried chewing on the dried squid, but it had gone flavorless too. I quickly grabbed a bottle from my cooler and drank it down in one go. After that, the fishing picked up. I started catching fish after fish, but honestly my mind was elsewhere, silently working until it started getting brighter. The full moon was gone. The woman, thankfully, never reappeared again after that night. I never did find out who or what she really was. I have my own ideas of what happened to her, though. I guess you can put two and two together in these situations. Something might have happened out here on the breakwater, and she still might be out there, somewhere at sea or lost below. I said a little prayer for her before and after I fished there. I have mixed feelings about it all, but I'm kind of glad I experienced it in a way.
This happened when I was still in junior college, studying nursing. I took a night shift job as a nurse aide because I had to. My tuition was covered through scholarships, but that didn't stretch far enough to cover how I was actually living. Rent, food, train fares, those things didn't wait. If I didn't work, I just didn't get by. The hospital I worked at was the same one where I was doing my clinical training, and that made it easier in a practical sense. I knew how to move around without getting in the way, I recognized faces, and I understood the basic routines well enough not to slow anyone down. Even so, working there at night felt different. During the day, everything moved with purpose. There were conversations, footsteps, alarms, constant interruptions. But at night, all of that fell away. The corridors were dimmer, the pace slowed down, and the sounds that remained seemed sharper than they probably should have been. The hum of machines, the shift of curtains, the distant wheels of trolleys moving somewhere down the ward. It was calmer, but it wasn't exactly comforting. There was always the sense that you were seeing a side of a hospital that most people never saw. At the time I was assigned to the surgical ward. A few days before everything happened, one of my patients, Mrs. Asano, was scheduled for surgery. She was in her 70s. Some days she was clear, others she wasn't. When she looked at me, she would call me by her granddaughter's name, and once she had hold of my hand, she rarely let go. There were moments where she seemed aware enough to follow what was happening around her, and others where she drifted somewhere else entirely. Sometimes while I was helping her, she would reach up and gently stroke my hair, smiling to herself. It wasn't unsettling exactly. It was more that it felt like I had stepped into someone else's place without meaning to. As a student nurse, she could be difficult. There were tasks that needed doing, and she didn't always cooperate. There were times I didn't know how to respond, or felt like I was doing something wrong no matter what I chose. Still, I kept going back to her room. If I had a spare moment, I would check on her. If I passed by, I would just look in, and at some point it stopped feeling like an obligation. It started to feel personal. On the day of her operation, she held my hand the entire way to the operating room. Her grip was tight, far stronger than I expected for someone her age. She kept looking at me as they wheeled her down the corridor. She wasn't just glancing, she was staring at me, like she was trying to read something on my face. "It'll be okay," I told her. "You'll be fine." I said it more than once, not because I had anything else to say, but because she seemed to need it. Even when we reached the operating room and the handover was done, she wouldn't let go. The nurses tried to reassure her. I tried. The doctor spoke to her more firmly, but she just shook her head and held onto my hand tighter. The surgeon eventually stepped in, watching the situation for a moment before speaking. "If she stays with you during the operation, would that help?" he asked. Mrs. Asano looked between us. Then she smiled, and her grip loosened a little bit. Because of that, I ended up scrubbing in and standing beside her during the procedure. I had chosen to become a nurse, but I had never been good with blood. The operation was meant to last 4 hours. It went on for more than 11. And at some point, I stopped keeping track of time properly. The lights above the table felt too bright to look at directly, the sounds of instruments too sharp, voices moved around me in a steady rhythm that I couldn't quite follow anymore. What I was aware of, constantly, was her hand. Even under anesthetic, she didn't let go. Her grip stayed firm, like some part of her was still aware enough to hold on. My palm became damp, but because I couldn't move enough to wipe it, my fingers began to lose sensation. Then the feeling came back as a deep ache settled into my joints and spread slowly up my arm. After a while, I stopped trying to adjust my hand. I just stood there and let her hold on. There was no point thinking about how much longer it would take. When it finally ended, the release didn't come immediately. 3 nurses had to help ease her fingers away from mine. Even then, it took time. My hand felt stiff and unresponsive when it was finally free, like I'd been holding something heavy for too long, and my body hadn't caught up with the fact that I could stop. I should have gone home, but instead I stayed for my shift. People noticed. One of the nurses brought me something to eat. A doctor passed me a drink without saying much. There was a quiet understanding in the way people spoke to me, like they knew I'd just pushed past what I should have, and there wasn't much to be done about it. I moved through the early part of the night like that, doing what needed to be done, not thinking too far ahead. Later, during rounds, I went back to Mrs. Asano's room, and I told myself it was because I was concerned about her condition, but that wasn't the whole reason. She was awake. Not just awake, but clear. The room was dim, lit by a small light near the bed. The machines beside her gave off a steady, quiet rhythm. The hallway light filtered through the gap in the door. Soft enough not to disturb the room, she turned her head when I entered. Her expression was calm in a way that I hadn't seen before. She said she wanted to talk for a little while. I stepped out, checked with the nurse on duty, and then went back in. When she spoke, there was no confusion. She told me that she had suspected for some time that I wasn't really her granddaughter. She said that she'd looked at my name tag and realized what my name actually was. She told me that she had known I was there during the operation, that she could feel someone holding her hand, and that it made her feel less alone. She spoke slowly but clearly, and every word made sense. I listened. I didn't interrupt her. When she finished, I told her that she needed to rest, that her body had been through a lot, and she needed some time to recover. I told her that once she was stronger, I would take her out into the garden in her wheelchair. She nodded, looking genuinely pleased at the idea. As I turned to leave, I reached for the light, and she smiled. "Thank you," she said. I have to say, that stayed with me. The rest of the shift passed without anything unusual, and I finished my work and went home, and I fell asleep almost instantly. Then I had a dream. Mrs. Asano was hanging over the edge of the hospital roof. Her hand was locked around mine. I was leaning over, trying to pull her up. At first, it felt like something I could manage, but then I looked down. There were shapes around her legs, not clear enough to make out individually, but there were many of them. They were wrapped around her ankles and calves, pulling her downward, and she was crying. She was sobbing. She was saying, "I don't want to die," and her body jerked as she tried to kick free. The weight increased. I could feel it, and my arm strained under it, the pain building from my wrist upward, deep and sharp. And if I let go, I knew she would fall. That was the only thing I could think about, so I pulled, slowly with everything I had, and I pulled her back up. When she was on the roof again, I looked at her legs, and there was nothing there. I leaned over the edge. There was no ground below, only darkness. Then a sudden gust of wind surged upwards. It caught me off balance, and right beside my ear, I heard a voice, low, heavy, like more than one voice speaking at once. "Don't interfere." I woke up. My clothes were damp with sweat, and the room felt weird for a few seconds, like I hadn't fully returned to it yet, and it took some time before I could move properly. I went to the shower, and while I was washing, I noticed something on my wrist, a bruise, clear enough that it didn't need explaining. The shape looked like fingers pressed into the skin. I got dressed and went straight back to the hospital, and when I asked about Mrs. Asano, I was told that she had gone into critical condition during the night, but she had stabilized. The relief came first. It settled quickly, then something else followed it. One of the day nurses, Miss Ito, saw me and suggested we get something to eat. I hadn't really realized how little I'd eaten lately, so I agreed. She took me somewhere quiet. We ate for a while without saying all too much. The atmosphere wasn't uncomfortable, but there was something behind it, something she hadn't said yet. After a while, she looked at me. "Did you have a strange dream?" she asked. I asked if she had one too. She nodded. Her face had gone pale. "I let go of a patient's hand in my dream," she said. And she started crying. Not suddenly. It was like something she'd been holding in had finally given way. The patient died. She told me she saw them in her dreams, clinging to her, asking for help. She said there were things around them, shapes, like shadows pulling them away. She spoke carefully, like she had gone over it many times in her head. If I understood what she meant, if I'd have let go, things might be different. That stayed with me. In the end, I didn't become a nurse. After graduating, I chose a different path. Sometime later, I heard what happened to Miss Ito. She had left the hospital. After that, she went in and out of psychiatric care. All she would say is, "It wasn't my fault," again and again. In the end, she jumped from the hospital. Mrs. Asano survived. She's still alive, actually. I still receive a New Year's card from her every year. The thing is, I still think about Miss Ito. She said it wasn't her fault. I don't know if that really matters, once you've decided to let go.
A few years ago, I had a job working as a wallpaper installer. Small brag, but people used to say I was one of the best among the younger guys. Well, anyway, one night after finishing a job, I drove out to see the girl I was dating at the time. She lived in Himejima, in Nishiyodogawa, Osaka. I don't remember the exact time, but it was probably past 10 p.m, sometime in February. If you know the area, you'll know the big kubota plant out there. The road runs along the river, and if you keep going, it opens up into this wide stretch of land, which is mostly private property and open fields that eventually turns into an inlet near the sea. You can drive pretty far before you hit a dead end. We parked as far in as we could and did what couples do. Chatting, messing around, and other stuff. Eventually we decided we wanted somewhere more private though, so we went to look for a love hotel. Around Route 43, there are a lot of them. We picked one at random and went in. I don't remember the name of the place or the room number. I wasn't exactly thinking about the details like that at that specific time. But the hotel is still there though. We took the elevator up and went into the room. Nothing stood out. We got on the bed right away with the lights still on. Thinking back now though, there's something I should mention. From the moment we stepped into the room, there were noises coming from the bathroom. Like something moving. A dull thud and then a bang. But again, this is a love hotel, and of course you expect these weird sounds, and, well, I assumed they were coming from another room. We started messing around, and then pretty quickly, something happened. The only way I can describe it is this sharp, high ringing sensation like a pressure in your ears. At the same time, the whole feel in the room went weird. The vibe died. If you've ever experienced sleep paralysis, it felt like the moment right before it hits. That sense that something is about to settle over you and that you're about to lose control of your body. I felt something similar to it before, during an earthquake, about 10 or 15 minutes before it happened. I remember waking up the woman I was with and telling her that something felt off. She brushed it off at first, but then she noticed it too, and then the earthquake happened. Well, this felt exactly like that. Back in the hotel, the ringing got stronger, and I remember thinking to myself, what is that? Then I realized I couldn't move. And at the same time she froze too. That's how I knew it wasn't just me. We both slowly turned our head towards each other, and the second our eyes met, we both screamed. We recoiled from each other so hard the bed shook. She grabbed the blanket and pulled it over her head completely, and I started yelling at her, half in panic, trying to force things back to normal. "That's not real, that's your face, right? Is it your face?" She didn't answer, but kept nodding under the blanket over and over. When we looked at each other in that moment, we weren't seeing each other's faces. We were seeing the faces of complete strangers, and I know how wild that sounds, right? But that's exactly what happened. She started making this thin breaking sound like she was about to cry, and I snapped at her to stop. Not because I was calm, but because I was barely holding it together myself. She kept whispering, "I can't." And then we looked at each other again, and we couldn't hold eye contact. When I finally forced myself to look at her once more, her face was completely normal, but her eyes weren't. They looked like they belonged to someone else, almost like a dead fish eyes. I said that to her. After that, we both kept our faces turned away, without making eye contact, and I realized that the room itself felt uncomfortable, like reality had been dulled in some way. I'm not someone who's sensitive to that kind of thing, and I don't believe in spirits, at least not at that moment. But something was undeniable, and that we needed to leave. So, we did. We tried to get dressed, but obviously we were shaking. My whole body was shaking so badly that I could barely stand. We turned away from each other as we got dressed, not trying to look up. We threw on whatever we could and walked out. The elevator was of course lined with mirrors, but we tried not to look at each other. I drove her back to her place, but that area is confusing at night. At one point I was about to turn down a side road when suddenly I had this strong feeling. At that exact moment, she shouted, "No, don't!" and I slammed on the brakes. We didn't even see anything. It was just this absolute certainty, like hitting a wall in your mind, that if we went that way, something would happen. After that, we started calling out directions as we drove, both of us saying the same thing without even looking at each other. Because roads we normally would have taken, we avoided without really knowing why. When we finally reached her street, I told her to call me once she got inside. She got out of the car, and we still hadn't looked directly at each other, and I drove away. For about a week, I couldn't bring myself to look in a mirror. She told me she was going through the same thing, that her eyes didn't look like her own. We tried talking about it, but every time we got close to describing what it was we saw, we'd go quiet. About a week later, she told me her eyes had gone back to normal. I believed her, or at least I wanted to. We stopped seeing each other after that. I've never been able to figure out if it was because the relationship was already falling apart, or because neither of us could look at the other without remembering that moment. It really was one of the most bizarre things that has ever happened to me, and I'm glad that it is now behind me. I used to live near Kyoto for a while, and on more than one occasion, I found myself at Fushima Inari Daishi late at night. Not intentionally. Usually I was there right at dusk on my way home, or maybe finishing up an errand. But I would almost always end up lingering around the Senbon Tori. You know that long trail of torii gates? That's the one. So one evening I had planned to take a walk along it just as the sun was setting. Thankfully the crowds were mostly gone, and there weren't any stray tourists blocking the path. A few people had told me that after dark, the feeling there changes. But of course, that is nonsense. At the beginning, I walked and it was nice and quiet. But about 15 minutes in, I began to feel something that made me feel uncomfortable. The path, which should have been straight and predictable, seemed to stretch on in a way that I didn't remember. I checked my phone, and my signal was gone. And that's when I heard a voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was a series of soft syllables coming from deeper in the gates. I called out, "Hello?" but was met with no reply. It was then I noticed that the sounds of wildlife in the surrounding area were gone. I walked a few steps, and then the voice stopped. For a moment I wondered if I should turn back, and that's when I heard it this time, but slightly behind me, and when I spun around there was nothing there. Then the voice came again, right beside me this time. My heart hammered in my chest, and I took another step. The row of torii gates no longer looked the same, so I stopped walking, and finally turned around and began going back the way I had came. And the voice was now gone. Eventually I saw the first light of the main entrance, and when I passed under the last gate, I turned towards town, and I could now hear the sound of cars and distant voices. It was the most bizarre experience, like going through those gates had taken me somewhere else entirely. I'm glad I never found out where.
I run a small studio that produces video and music, just barely keeping it going. But these days, more and more creators are making their own content and upload it themselves to video platforms. So the demand for shutting yourself away in a studio and producing audio has visibly fallen off. To get through the financial strain, I started taking on work converting old video and audio stored on magnetic tape into digital formats, and lately that has become my studio's main business. Now that streaming is the norm, there are plenty of younger people who have never even had the experience of buying physical media like CDs, DVDs, or Blu-rays in order to enjoy music or films on their own. So old men like me sometimes feel a real sense of anxiety and sadness at being left behind by the times. But before DVDs and CDs were commonplace, it was perfectly normal to enjoy things that had been recorded onto magnetic cassette tapes. There may well still be old VHS tapes or even older 8mm film sitting in your parents' house or your grandparents' house. Unlike digital data, those magnetic tapes are heavily affected by the conditions that they were stored in. They grow mold or the tape itself snaps because it has to make physical contact with the machine head during playback. Deterioration over time is a major problem, and there's no avoiding it. From 8mm film that now has historical value because it captured family life or streets from the early Showa period, to the VHS tapes that all fathers over Japan used to film their children's sports days. Once home video cameras became common, there are probably huge numbers of old recordings still lying around the country, unseen and forgotten. A lot of families want to watch these old images again, but the tape is worn down, or they no longer have a deck to play it on. So when someone brings me a tape, I borrow it, clean up the distortion in the video, and the degraded audio as much as I possibly can, digitize it, and make it so that they can revisit the past whenever they like. Seeing clients light up when memories of a family member who's passed away come back to them is genuinely heartwarming. Anyway, that introduction has gone on long enough. When you do this kind of work every day, you occasionally come across footage that is, for want of a better word or phrase, deeply unnerving. Sometimes it's something like a child filming what appears to be the client and their spouse arguing through a gap in a sliding Pusuma door decades ago. Sometimes I'd rather not go into too much detail, but it's what looks very much like privately recorded pornography. One tape among them contained the most horrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. So, while trying to respect the dignity of both the person in the footage and the client who brought it in, I'd like to explain it as simply as I can. It started with a single VHS tape brought in by a man in his 70s. He was one of that first generation of gadget obsessives, you could say. Back in the early days of home computers in the 1970s, he was the sort of person who poured most of his wages into machines and spent his time absorbed in programming. Even as a professional who works in this field, I've found his knowledge of recording media and playback equipment impressive. And yet, even he had admitted defeat, and he had brought me a VHS tape. He told me he could just barely play the first few dozen seconds of it, but the image was so badly distorted that all he could make out was what seemed to be a woman he had dated before meeting his wife. An ex-girlfriend, in other words. Naturally, he said he could hardly let his wife watch something like that after all these years, but at the same time he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. More than that, he said he had absolutely no memory of filming anything like it. He couldn't recognize anything from the stills he could see. So he wanted to know if there was any way that I could restore it so he could at least see the contents of the tape. I was honestly uneasy about whether I could recover footage that even a man with this level of skill had failed to restore, but there was also something embarrassed and almost boyish about the way he spoke. And I was curious myself, so I agreed to take on the job on the condition that I would only be paid if the restoration was successful. That same night, I loaded the tape into one of our dedicated machines and I started playback. On the screen was a beautiful woman who looked to be in her 20s, wearing denim trousers and a floral shirt, sitting at the edge of a bed in what looked like the plain, impersonal room of a business hotel. She had both hands resting on her knees and her back was straight, and for a while she simply stared into the camera. Then, just as her mouth began to open a little, the image started to break up. It became jerky, frame by frame bursts. There was this low noise, and the lower half of the picture turned to mush. Then the upper half, the damage moving back and forth across the screen. VHS stores its signals on magnetic tapes, and the recorded paths on the tape are called tracks. Think of them like roads or railway lines. Unlike digital data, if the track on the tape and the playback head inside the video deck do not line up exactly, then the picture slips, rolls upwards or downwards, or collapses into mangled image. Video deck manufacturers used to build in knobs or switches called tracking so that the user could adjust it manually to get a clean picture. But as time passed and video decks disappeared from the market, the old cassette tapes left behind in people's homes deteriorated. They picked up magnetic corruption, and a growing number of people found that even if they somehow got a hold of a deck and fiddled with it endlessly, the tracking, they could still not get the tape to play properly. Since I make my living as a video restoration professional, dealing with abnormal tracking is just one of the things that we pride ourselves on. With dedicated optical equipment and digital software-based approaches, I can usually restore that sort of damage almost perfectly, so I got to work. Little by little, the distortion from the footage settled down, and as it did, the audio began to come through. As I said, the woman had spent some time silently staring into the camera, then eventually, she opened her mouth and began speaking fluently. She spoke her name, that day's weather, and a concert by a band that was probably popular at the time. That in itself was not strange. But what made it unsettling started around 3 minutes into the recording. Without warning, while keeping her legs hanging down off the side of the bed, she raised both arms above her head as if in a banzai pose or like a celebration, and started lowering her back onto the bed and sitting back up over and over, as though she were doing sit-ups, using only the upper half of her body. If you try to picture that for a moment, you'll understand just how unnatural that is. Unless your feet are being held in place somehow, your legs are going to lift up when you sit up, right? You end up using momentum. But the woman in that video kept both feet flat on the floor, perfectly planted, while only her upper body moved with a violent force, springing back and forth. And even during that, she kept talking, not shouting, not straining. She went on speaking in a quiet, flat tone about nothing in particular, the most mundane topics, train times, weird things like that. And the voice that she was using did not match her movement at all. She did not sound out of breath. It was as if someone had recorded narration separately and laid it over the image afterwards. At that point, I had realized I had missed something in the audio waveform inside the editing software. Until then, I had assumed the sound had been recorded in stereo, but when I looked more closely, I saw on the LHC and the RHC, the left and right channels, were showing completely different waveform patterns. And what I had been hearing as the image recovered was only the left channel. Now the right channel had been muted. So I switched the signal output to the right channel, and the instant I did, an ear-splitting sound tore through the monitor speakers, and I genuinely thought that my heart had stopped for a second there. It's so difficult to describe. It was not quite a voice, not quite a noise. It sounded like someone screaming, a sustained ah tone over and over, layered on top of itself countless times. Now, I've worked on recordings for bands whose vocalists can produce astonishing death growls, and I'm used to high volume recordings, but I mean, this was different. There was a sickening sound to it. The whole studio seemed to fill with it. I felt dizzy and sick. I cut the signal going into the monitor speakers, but it didn't stop. A disturbing chill ran through me. I yanked the speaker cable out so hard I nearly tore it free. And still the sound didn't stop. I think I must have blacked out right after, because the last thing I remember seeing before I lost consciousness was the woman with both arms raised above her head, her hair standing up wildly and her eyes rolled back, and she was screaming straight at me. But I know it was at the camera, but it felt like it was at me. Maybe because the tracking had broken apart again, her body was deforming in a stiff, ugly rhythm, repeating the motion of falling backwards and rising up at high speed like a crude GIF made of only 2 frames. But her face was perfectly clear, and it was looking directly at me. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I have no idea how long I was out for. Maybe a few minutes, maybe a few hours. But what I do remember very clearly is the awkward expression on my coworker's face when he shook my shoulder to wake me up. "The hell are you watching?" he said. He was staring at the monitor with a puzzled look on his face. The room on screen was the same hotel room I had been editing just before. But the bed was there too, but on the white sheet where the young woman had once been sitting, there was now only something that looked like a dark red stain in the shape of a human figure with its arms stretched upwards in a banzai celebration kind of pose. The stain ran down the edge of the bed, thick and wet looking, and continued onto the carpet where her feet had been placed, leaving behind clear footprints. Was she barefoot? That was all I found myself thinking as I stared at the computer screen. I explained what had happened to my coworker, and when we rewound the footage and watched it again, the tape no longer showed the woman at all. It was only that unpleasant stained bed, continuing on and on, until the recording cut off abruptly. "These things happen," my coworker said. He seemed fairly detached about the whole thing. And with that, I stopped thinking about the tape any further. I told the client that I had not been able to restore the footage, and I returned it to him. And let me tell you, he seemed deeply disappointed about that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible from the past might be dragged back up if that tape were pursued any further. So I gently suggested that he should probably just dispose of it. I'm sorry this has turned into a bit of a rambling story, but thank you for reading it to the end. I guess the only thing I could say is if any of you have any old videos asleep somewhere in your family home, then I might recommend digitizing them before they deteriorate beyond recovery.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's collection of scary stories, and again, thank you to J Nightmares for providing the stories. I always love our little trips into Japan. And I think we will do another one, hopefully next month or so. I would like to extend a special thank you to my members and patrons whose names you can see on screen, and if you would like to join their ranks and get some cool perks, like some cemetery stories, which I just launched yesterday on Patreon, you can follow the links down below to find out more. I would just like to say that, sadly, J Nightmares was one of the amazing creators who was targeted by YouTube's demonetization bot quite erroneously, and it would mean a great deal to me if you would show him some love. So links are on screen now and down below. Until next time, guys, stay awesome and good night.